Hi guys, it's Debbie, and today it's time to look back at everything I watched this month, giving you some ideas about interesting films and series, and also offering my small review about every title I watched. Now, I admit it, this month I watched a lot, but this was probably my one and only lifetime opportunity as we have to stay at home. So knowing that there aren't huge releases out there, I filled my spare time by catching up with many titles I had on my watch list. I would also love to hear what you've been watching, what you've enjoyed, what you wouldn't recommend. Leave all your thoughts with a comment down below. Now grab a cup of tea or a snack and let's jump right into the list. So the previous month, March, had actually ended with me watching a film called Waves, which also features Lucas Hedges. I've always enjoyed his films and I'm trying to catch up with more of them, so right after wrapping up the month with Waves, this month opened with Boy Erased, in which Hedges portrays a young man who, as many others, was forced to undergo gay conversion therapy. He was raised in a very religious household in which homosexuality is seen as a sin, and he is forced to attend a program in which, through all a series of terrible measures, people are basically forced to reject their sexual orientation with all a series of terrible consequences. The plot is actually based on a real person's story, and I really like this film because it covers the topic with a very mature approach. It never falls into just a bunch of shocking moments. It tackles the issue of following what your family wants for you and accepting who you are, the argument of religion and tolerance, and the child-parent relationship, which was wonderfully portrayed with Nicole Kidman as the mother. Now for the next title, I think we should just jump to something everybody has been talking about. Let's get it out of the way. Tiger King. Tiger King is a documentary series mostly focusing on the figure of Joe Exotic, a big cat owner in the United States who not only had a questionable manner of running his zoo, but who also had a very peculiar, turbulent lifestyle. We're speaking of hitmen, presidential campaigns, murder investigations, feuds with other zookeepers and animal rights activists, near-death escapes, arsons, Las Vegas and Instagram models, people losing limbs and lives. As a matter of fact, the full documentary title is Tiger King: Murder, Mayhem and Madness. I think this series had such a huge success in the current situation because people are searching for something to distract them, something to take their mind off of present events. And Tiger King is so detached from normality, it's so absurd and hysteric that the only thing that goes through your mind while watching it is what the actual fuck. I then checked out a film many of you had been suggesting, and that is Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Unfortunately, I haven't read the comic, but I still thoroughly enjoyed the film. I really wish I had seen this years ago. I can imagine myself quoting lines as comebacks to people. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is the story of a young aspiring musician who meets the love of his life, but who basically has to battle all her weird, evil, strong exes who come at him. This film is very peculiar under many different aspects, from how comic book imagery is included, the witty way the protagonists interact, and I would definitely say this is perfect if you're onto the geekier side of things, as all the characters are. The film actually has a cast of pretty famous faces, so as you keep on watching, more and more familiar names are popping up and it just makes it even funnier. After that, I watched a film and a documentary which both tie into a topic I had began exploring in March with a series called Unorthodox. The series covered the real-life story of a woman who escaped from a very close-knit Jewish community in New York City. A group of people who basically live detached from the outside world, they barely learn to speak English, with women living a life with little education or working prospects, being required to have as many children as possible, and with the idea of abandoning that lifestyle being met with heavy criticism bordering onto hostility. As the topic really interested me, this month I watched a documentary called One of Us, which covers other stories of people who either wanted to leave that community, for example a woman who was threatened and mistreated, or people who still loved being part of that community but question a lot of the strict rules. I also watched a film called Minash, which instead covers the fictional story of a man from that community, a man who isn't particularly fond of all the strict rules to follow, and who after the death of his wife was left alone with his son, trying to balance a big workload and following his religious duties while being pressured into finding a new wife. All these works offer different but equally mature approaches to the subject so that we can form our opinion on the matter. Next was time to watch a very confusing film called Personal Shopper with Kristen Stewart. It covers the story of a woman who works as a personal shopper for a celebrity in Paris, but aside from a regular job, she is also a sort of medium. She is trying to communicate with the dead. So most of the film follows the protagonist around in her daily life, but communicating with the dead soon becomes creepier and more intense, and odd events begin to occur. This is definitely not a film that had me on the edge of my seat, biting my nails. It's just very different from similar plots in which at some point we have the answers. And also I believe some may have antagonized it because of Kristen Stewart portraying the protagonist, and her and Robert Pattinson seem to have this curse of having been in Twilight in the past. If you are looking for a creepy, nail-biting horror, I would also recommend watching The Invisible Man. This film was absolutely frightening. It's the story of a woman whose very controlling husband passes away, but even after her death, that she still feels his presence. She thinks he is haunting her somehow. Of course, nobody believes her. She's not even sure if she believes herself. But things then spiral out of control, and the film throws at us one incredibly terrifying scene after the other. And the amazing fact is that Elizabeth Moss managed to keep us screaming and covering our eyes, even without us basically seeing her enemy. She was terrific. I'm afraid to say too much because of spoilers, but definitely give this a go. Another good horror film I watched is an older one from the 90s called Misery, based on a novel by Stephen King. Now, Misery is actually the work that inspired that famous prank in which a woman goes to a bookstore and flips out when she can't find a certain Misery book, and she gets really angry at the employees.
What is wrong with you all? I don't understand what is happening!
No worries, man, no worries.
I'm looking for a cock-a-doodle ball!
I can order it for you.
And this is because in the film, in the works, the protagonist is a writer, a very famous writer, who created a series of books called Misery. One day, he has a huge accident in a snowy remote region, and he is saved by a woman who says she is his #1 fan. She's a woman who is insanely obsessed with his works and who keeps him as a hostage in her house, demanding all sorts of requests concerning the books. One of the scariest elements in the film is just how unpredictable the situation is, as the woman will absolutely flip out for no apparent reason in one scene and then return creepily calm in the next. Kathy Bates actually won an Oscar for Best Actress for a role here. Following up is a very interesting documentary called Crip Camp: A Disability Revolution, which narrates the story of the movement on behalf of the disabled community for equal rights in the United States. The camp part of the title is based on the fact that many members of the movement actually used to attend the same summer camp, where they initially joined forces and realized that together they could make a change. Because all the accessibility you see today, even simple things such as curbs which dip so wheels can easily pass over, practicable spaces, or even just appropriate restrooms, was something where how these protesters would go for days on end on hunger strikes. To hear of the Capitol crawl in 1990, in which many demonstrators left their walk-in aids and pulled themselves up the steps of the Capitol in Washington. And one sentence really stuck with me when the leader of the movement said, "If I have to be thankful for an accessible bathroom, whenever will I be equal?" After that, I did a bad thing. In the present situation, I decided to watch the #1 most popular pandemic-related film, Contagion. The only reason I did this was because it was annoying me. It was recommended everywhere, probably because of the current events. So out of anger, I watched it. It wasn't too bad for a pandemic movie because it covers a sudden, dangerous worldwide outbreak, but without people turning into zombies or with unlikely and exaggerated events. It literally looks exactly like what's going on at the moment, just that the patients have different symptoms and the numbers are much higher. Anyway, jokes aside, if you really are looking for a film on that topic, it's not terrible and it actually has a pretty impressive cast. I don't mind the genre, I just get annoyed when it has to become a World War Z kind of plot. That's why I've been postponing watching Cargo with Martin Freeman. I then watched a film which had been intriguing me because of its premise. It's called In Fabric, and it is the horror story of an evil red dress. In the film, a woman buys this red dress from a shop in which everybody looks like witches or vampires, but as she wears it, odd things start to happen, people start to get seriously hurt. It's as if the dress were cursed. I was expecting the plot to go a little more down the horror path and less down the plain weird one, but instead there are many bizarre moments, usually involving instructions for washing machines. In some points it even nearly felt like a parody of horror movies, but for the following scene it would suddenly switch back to the 70s inspired terror. If you have seen this film, let me know what you made of it. But if we have to speak about wonderful cinematography and a really weird plot, The Holy Mountain is this month's winner. This film is actually generally acknowledged as one of the weirdest films of all time, and I agree. It's the story of a man who looks a lot like Jesus and who, while exploring his city, climbs up a tall tower and meets a mysterious alchemist. The alchemist takes the man as a sort of apprentice, in addition to doing other weird things such as turning his feces into gold, and gives him a lot of information. And with the information the alchemist gives, the plot moves on to even weirder events. The whole film is ridden with symbology, religious references, and religious provocations, surreal imagery, and the actors actually took psychedelic mushrooms before carrying out certain scenes, and director Jodorowsky actually claims he didn't sleep for a whole week before filming began. Because we're on the topic of bizarre films, a few weeks back over on Twitch we were discussing the topic of weird movies, and one of the films you suggested was Tusk, which turns out was definitely a good choice for the topic. It is the story of a podcaster who ends up staying at the house of a mysterious guy in Canada, supposedly just for an interview about his adventures. But the situation ends up turning into a much darker scenario, which, without spoilers, involves an obsession with walruses. And I'm going to leave it at that, because the first reaction, without knowing anything about the plot, is priceless. After all these peculiar films, I watched a totally regular film starring Oscar Isaac and Jessica Chastain, and it's called A Most Violent Year, referring to 1981, which was the most brutal year in regards to criminality in New York City. Isaac portrays the owner of an oil company who is going through many financial troubles, and who decides to make one last large investment to get things back on track, buying a large terminal. This film is about ruthless business, competition, the fight against time, the desperate need for money, and the line between what is legal and what isn't. This film is definitely not one of my favourite ones out of all this month, but it still made me think a lot, especially of how many people out there are probably doing business. Instead, a film I really enjoyed was Mid-90s, which is Jonah Hill's first film as a director. It's set in the 90s skater scene in LA, and the protagonist is a kid who is bullied by his older brother, who doesn't have a safe haven at home, and who ends up hanging out with much older kids, who he idolizes, but of course have much older interests, which could be harmful for him. I didn't live during the skater era in LA during the 90s, but I think the film went beyond that. It was a nostalgic moment about childhood in general. Actually, of that moment when you no longer want to be considered a child, you want to be treated as an older person, but you still want to be able to go back home safe every night, so you don't want to think about responsibilities. Fun fact, the cast of Mid-90s actually includes Lucas Hedges, and by that point I was realizing that although I'd seen many of his films, I hadn't actually seen that many. So I decided to catch up with one of the last ones I still had to check out, and that was Ben is Back, in which Hedges portrays a young guy struggling with addiction. He's trying to recover, he's trying to stay clean, and he tries to call on his family at Christmas. The unexpected visit creates a bit of chaos as he isn't yet a reliable person drug-wise. Even though he's trying to stay sober, he's still at risk of having very destructive behaviours. So within the family, there are those who are still not sure about having him around, and then there is a mother, portrayed by Julia Roberts, who loves him so much she just sets everything aside. So it's a beautiful depiction of family relationships and unfortunately, of how addiction doesn't only affect the users, but everybody that surrounds them. Speaking of lighter topics, around this time I watched a ridiculously funny film called What We Do in the Shadows, created by Taika Waititi, a famous director of many popular films, including a personal favourite, Jojo Rabbit. What We Do in the Shadows is a mockumentary, a fake documentary about a group of flatmates in Wellington, New Zealand, who also happen to be vampires. So throughout the documentary, they explain how they live, how they split house chores, how their life is, as if it were all normal. So for example, when they have to get ready to go for a night out, they can't look into the mirror, so they have to draw each other. They have a lot of trouble making relationships because of their relationship with humans and their blood. It's absolutely hilarious, mostly because everything the characters do is presented as if it's just legit normal. I then rewatched Richie Rich, a childhood favourite back from the 90s, starring Macaulay Culkin during his the peak childhood stardom phase, especially with the Home Alone films. In Richie Rich, he portrays a ridiculously wealthy kid, wealthy meaning McDonald's inside his house, along with many other luxuries. But he is struggling to make friends as he is mostly asked to carry out boring adult activities. But one day he meets and befriends some kids from a very different background, and they get into all sorts of adventures. This film is delightful. It teaches kids and adults about what really is important, about personal values, and still today it makes me absolutely jealous. I wish I could have had those things that Richie had. I then watched a film I wouldn't personally recommend, although it has been described by others as tremendous and hilarious, so I guess everybody has their different taste. I'm speaking about Other People, in which the plot can be summed up as a family in which the mother is dying of cancer and everybody else is still trying to get on with lives while they're being weighed down, of course, by this situation. And the title Other People refers to the fact that we always imagine bad things happening to other people until we become them. It's one of those films that doesn't have a particularly complex storyline, but which relies on the natural interactions between people, more of a people-watching story. The acting was great. There is one scene in which Jesse Plemons' character loses his patience in a supermarket while looking for a specific product for his mother, and he just breaks down, and it is heartbreaking and beautiful. But there is no way I would describe this whole film as superb and near perfect as others have. Maybe it just wasn't the kind of film I was looking for. I just felt depressed while I was watching it and nothing else. Instead, a film which made me feel sad, but in a manner I understood and appreciated, was Tyrannosaur, which by the way also came up during that famous Bizarre Films Twitch stream. Tyrannosaur is the story of a woman, Olivia Colman, who is having trouble at home with her abusive husband and who meets and befriends another man, Peter Mullen. The two meet in a very rough manner, but then get to know each other better, and the new friend definitely has many issues of his own. And by the end of the film, when you realise what you've been watching, I'm not going to spoil anything, you feel completely drained of any emotion, but that's what the film was aiming for. It's just a pity that this is the kind of film that will unlikely reach a vast audience, so thank you for the suggestion. I then caught up with a film I was so pleased to finally watch, and that is Watchmen. Now, I tend to have trouble when it comes down to superhero related works, mostly because they often tend to be part of much larger franchises you need to know in detail in order to understand what is going on. So I always naively avoided Watchmen because I always thought it was part of something much larger I needed to know better. But being a standalone movie, I was able to thoroughly watch it and I loved it. It's a bleak vision of a city in which superheroes are seen in a negative light. There is also an imminent threat of the Cold War and of a nuclear holocaust. Everybody is on edge. It's a pretty grim and dystopian environment, and when a former superhero is murdered, his retired colleagues try to investigate what happened. I love this film because it gives us the time to get to know each of the characters, but still while keeping the main storyline very entertaining. It felt so good to finally discover some new characters without feeling the pressure of the 15 previous films. After that, I watched a film called The Kill Team, a pretty recent title distributed by A24. Now, A24 is a company which is known for being usually tied to alternative uncommon plots. I'm talking Swiss Army Man, The Death of Dick Long, Midsummer, The Lighthouse, or artsy projects like Ladybird, The Florida Project. So when I heard about a film called The Kill Team, based on real events during the war in Afghanistan, I was like, wait a minute, That sounds way too normal. And as a matter of fact, it is one of the most normal films on the A24 list. But it was still very well put together. It played a lot of emotions without leaving out completely the brutality of war. Basically, it's the story of abuse of power on behalf of some US soldiers in Afghanistan and of the code of silence on the matter. The protagonist is a young recruit who sees what's going on. He finds himself involved in all the situation and has to figure out what to do. I then watched a film which completely overturned my expectations, and that was Sorry to Bother You. I say overturned because everything about the promotion of this film screams sassy, empowered youth, young, inspired, talented people weighing out a safe career against fulfilling their dreams. But the final plot takes off from that and dives down a mind-boggling plot I was absolutely not prepared for, all paired with a really fun and bold visual style. Without spoilers, the protagonist is a young man who ends up working as a telemarketer. In order to make more sales, he uses what he calls his white voice and ends up going higher and higher up in the system. But the higher up he goes, the weirder reality becomes. He finds out some freaky things. I really can't say too much without spoiling the experience. Then April was the month in which I discovered a Hong Kong director I ended up loving, Wong Kar-wai. Now, the posters for his films had been under my radar for quite a while now, but this was the month in which I finally sat down and watched a few of them. The first title of his I watched is probably one of his most famous films, Chungking Express. This film looks perfect on every Tumblr dashboard because there is an intense focus on the aesthetic component of the film. Nearly all the shots are impactful, and also it's from the early 90s, so it emanates those retro vibes. The film is split in two parts, two love stories. The first story is about a policeman who keeps on thinking about his past relationship. He can't get a past lover off of his mind, while the second one, which was my favourite, is another love story, again between a policeman and a quirky snack bar worker. If you're looking for memorable cinematography, nostalgic soundtracks, the aesthetic for loneliness, and a lot of romance but not in the usual lovey-dovey way, this is for you. By the hands of the same director, I also watched Fallen Angels, which is a sort of sequel to Chungking Express. It's supposed to be set in the same world, so there are many similar elements. Some of the actors carry over. There are references between the two films, and the structure is alike, so two different storylines. Again, I prefer the second one to the first one. The first story is about a hitman and a mysterious woman who is sort of his partner in crime, so she leaves him messages at the house. She cleans his house, but she is also super in love with him. The second story instead, the one I absolutely loved, was about this very ingenious guy who, to make money, would basically go out in the night and open up businesses which are closed at night, so butchers, hairdressers, ice cream parlours, and he would serve any customer that would turn up in the middle of the night just to make some money without knowing anything about the job. I also watched a third Wong Kar-wai film called In the Mood for Love. This is more of a slow-paced film. It's set during the 60s, and it introduces us to two neighbours who move into the same building around the same time and slowly develop a friendship. Could it be something deeper? Just as with the other two films, this story also focuses a lot on attraction, fascination, romance, rather than the straightforward element of love or sex. I also found this concept of romance, but in a longing way, in another film called Tiger Tail, this time by Taiwanese-American director Alan Yan. Tiger Tail is a story of a man's life all the way from his childhood, living with his grandparents and meeting and befriending a neighbouring girl. Their love and friendship goes on for years, and the film covers the issues of growing up, growing apart, staying together, having to make life choices, possibly moving abroad. So it conveys a different mood from the typical erotic on-screen version of love. It's more about distance and longing, but it's equally interesting. I then watched, I'm just going to say it, I watched the Emoji Movie. I knew more or less what the plot was about, but because of the immense criticism this film received, I decided I had to watch it with my own eyes. I had to figure out what the whole situation was about. The film is set inside a phone, and the protagonists are emojis. One day the main character, the meh emoji, messes up everything because he shows all different emotions instead of his regular meh face. So him and his friends leave the messaging app and explore the rest of the phone. they get into all sorts of adventures. Now this film is great if you're a small child. It's funny, there are all these silly emojis who do fun things such as playing Just Dance, everything in the phone is alive, even the viruses and the spam are alive. So of course adults wouldn't enjoy it. This isn't the meaningful WALL-E or Iron Giant movie both adults and children enjoy. This is for small children. Now what I particularly didn't like about this film was just how full of product placement it is. There are many irritating moments in which the characters do something for way too long inside an app. For example, there are very long moments with Just Dance, with Candy Crush. These sequences actually felt more developed than many other moments in the film. But anyway, my curiosity was finally satisfied. I then watched a film I had never heard of before. It wasn't on my watch list, I just discovered it one evening and decided to give it a go. Red State. This is the story of a group of extremely religious people who open the plot by kidnapping and heavily punishing some kids who weren't exactly following the view of their world. The situation then gets violently out of hand, the police are called in, there's a huge standoff, it gets pretty bad. The premise was interesting, but the main section of the plot focused a lot on mostly just shooting, a lot of just the standoff. It only got interesting again towards the end of the film. So unfortunately, I can't actually say much about this film without ruining the few spoiler-packed moments, but it did make me curious about another film I'm planning on watching in the future called The Most Hated Woman in America, which stars Melissa Leo, who in Red State portrays instead an incredibly fanatic religious person. I then watched a series called Insatiable, which actually has some pretty bad reviews, and I partially agree with them. The protagonist is a high schooler who used to be very overweight and bullied, but who after an accident loses all the weight and becomes beautiful. But instead of being a good person also on the inside, as soon as she sees people desire her, she becomes greedy and selfish and gets into all sorts of troubles which then her hilarious mentor lawyer has to fix. Now the trouble with this series is not the point of associating beauty with a better personality, something which the trailer might have conveyed but which the actual plot doesn't. An actual problem with this series is that it is incredibly funny but only for the first few episodes, and it then just becomes boring and repetitive. The first season consists of 12 episodes, which are all nearly 1 hour long, and they always revolve around the same thing. So protagonist doing some damage, everybody else having to run after her to fix it. The only character who saved the series is the lawyer. He is so funny, but that definitely wasn't enough for me to watch a full other long second season, and anyway, after that the whole project was cancelled because of bad reviews. I then watched a film which was incredibly popular a few years ago, Atomic Blonde, with Charlize Theron and James McAvoy, who portray spies in Berlin during the 80s, so everything has a very edgy, electronic music, sexy vibe. The problem with the film is that it often abandons the plot in favour of that edgy, sexy vibe. I was lost trying to understand the actual espionage story, with the premise being that Charlize Theron is a spy sent to Berlin to recover information about a list of agents from James McAvoy, who instead is the unreliable, funny character. I guess this film never planned on being on a serious Bridge of Spies espionage movie. It had great action sequences, the background story was intriguing, but it always had to pile on these empty interactions between the characters and scream in your face just how hot and intriguing and edgy everybody is. But let's talk about a very different genre now. Bruno, starring Sacha Baron Cohen. Baron Cohen is known for portraying many recognisable characters in various skits, and also in his famous films like Borat, The Dictator, Ali G. In this case, his character is Bruno, a very loud, obnoxious fashion reporter who moves from Austria to the United States to look for a job and basically become famous because he believes he is incredibly talented. Instead, he ends up in all a series of embarrassing situations and hilarity ensues. And it got even funnier when I discovered that many scenes were actually taken from real-life moments. For example, he actually did crash a fashion show. Some criticise Sacha Baron Cohen for being offensive, and I get that he has a very politically incorrect style, but it's never done in a purposely hateful manner. He just makes good-spirited humour about everybody, himself included. I actually watched another one of his films this month called Grimsby, also known as the Brothers Grimsby. Out of all his films I've seen, this is at the moment the one I enjoyed the least. Maybe because his character didn't have such a prominent comedic role as other films, but it's still pretty funny. It's the story of a totally regular guy from the UK who just lives for the pub and football and who has 11 children to look after. But he really misses his brother who went missing years before. Turns out his brother is a top-notch secret agent working at the highest levels. When the two meet again, of course, Sacha Baron Cohen's character gets completely in the way, they are totally different, and the commotion creates even more comedy. Then at some point every month, I end up late at night watching creepy investigation films from the 90s. The first one I watched is Kiss the Girls, which I'm pretty sure I had already seen at some point in the past, because I had many déjà vus throughout all the first half of the film. It's the story of a series of girls who mysteriously vanish, and the uncle of one of these girls is a forensic psychologist, Morgan Freeman, who joins in the investigation into finding out who the culprit behind all of this. I even watched the sequel to this film, Along Came a Spider, in which Morgan Freeman's character is contacted by a man who kidnapped the daughter of a US senator. This film is barely exciting compared to its previous chapter. I won't even go into the plot because it's just a very, very predictable investigation. But if you're looking for a totally creepy serial killer Criminal Minds kind of film, I would definitely recommend another one called Copycat. It's a thriller I watched this month and which really ticked all the boxes. One of the main characters is a psychologist, an expert in serial killers, but who years before the events of the film was actually attacked by one of them. She survives, but obviously she's scarred for life. Many years later, another killer is out on the streets and the police turn to this doctor for her help and knowledge on the topic, while she's still traumatized from the events in her own life and scared and paranoid about what is going on. Now, this was a great thriller along those creepy investigative 90s lines I was speaking about. Following up, remember how I stupidly get annoyed at films when they are repeatedly recommended all over different platforms, and then I decide to watch them just to get them out of the way? I did the same thing with a film called Tall Girl because Netflix was recommending it across every category. At one point it was even under the holiday movie section for no reason whatsoever. Now, although this film was everywhere, I wouldn't recommend it at all. The idea behind the film is okay. It's the story of a girl who feels uncomfortable because of how tall she is. And if you think about it, we've seen films cover confidence under all aspects, but never for somebody who feels uncomfortable for being too tall, so it's an interesting choice. But instead of covering the topic in a manner that would be both light and intriguing for a younger audience, but still getting the message of happiness and acceptance across, it chose the path of a very, very boring storyline and the abnormal exaggeration of the issue. For example, the opening scene features the protagonist sitting down, a boy approaches her, and when she stands up, the camera shoots her as if she were some sort of giant, filling the whole room up to the ceiling, towering over this terrifying kid. The whole film is packed with terrible scenes, poor dialogue, ridiculous love ties, cringe-packed interactions. If you are looking for something about acceptance and being a kind person, I would rather recommend a film called Dumpling, again available on Netflix. I then finished a film many of you have been asking me to watch and which I'd actually already started watching but I never completed it, and that is Under the Skin with Scarlett Johansson. This film actually split audience reactions because on the one hand it's visually engaging, dark, intriguing. On the other hand, some moments are very weird. The film silently follows Scarlett Johansson's character who travels around looking for men to meet. But let's say it's not for the usual intent. I don't really know how to explain this without ruining the plot. It has some very unexpected moments. The first part of the film is very confusing. There are a lot of images which are breathtaking, but which don't make much sense. But as you reach the end of the story, all the pieces start to come together, still maintaining a layer of mystery and symbology. So Under the Skin leaves the story open to many interpretations. I personally enjoyed it, but I don't think it's the kind of film I want to watch and rewatch many other times. Following up, after a lot of thinking and polling you on social media, I eventually got round to watching Honey Boy. My doubts about this film were based on the fact that the story derives from Shia LaBeouf's personal life. So I was unsure whether I should know more about the actor or whether I was just good to go with my basic knowledge about him. Many of you said it was okay, and as a matter of fact, I later realised that you could actually watch this film without even knowing who Shia LaBeouf is. It's just inspired from events in his life. Honey Boy is a story of an actor who is struggling with alcoholism. He has violent outbursts, which his therapist puts down to childhood trauma. So during therapy, he thinks about his past, in which he lived with a very demanding and not understanding father who would pressure him a lot. So the story is about finding yourself, about how your upbringing can influence your personality, about accepting your past. I definitely love this film. There is also Shia LaBeouf in it. He portrays his father, and his person is portrayed by Lucas Hedges. So I believe by now I've watched all of Lucas Hedges' films. The child actor who portrays Shia LaBeouf in his younger years was also great, so I would absolutely recommend this. Around the same time, I was making a video for here on YouTube about Twilight, and so I was thinking back at all the films I used to watch during high school. And one film that kept on coming back to mind was The Spectacular Now, but I realised I couldn't remember anything about the plot, so I decided to rewatch it. Upon rewatching it, I realised why I didn't remember anything about the story. Because regardless of it being a perfect portrayal of a high school summer with partying, first kisses and boyfriends and studying and the future being close but still not an issue, the actual plot itself is kind of vague and not memorable. It's just a summer in which these two kids, portrayed by Shailene Woodley and Miles Teller, get to know each other, they fall in love, they spend all their days together, but there's not something actually specific going on. There's nothing wrong with that, it's just that vague teen mood of one day rolling into the other, of not having any responsibility, of just enjoying the moment. And it made me wish that it was 2012 again and we were just out enjoying the summer. I actually watched another unmemorable film, but not in a light, artsy, meaningful way, but in a way that didn't really captivate me, and that was Low Tide. This is the story of a group of kids who, as all kids, spend their time hanging around, dreaming of girls, watching TV, but one day they decide to break into a house to see what they can find, and a few of them end up stealing a bag full of what turn out to be very valuable coins. They don't tell the others, but the tension in the group starts to build and outside people start to figure things out. I don't really know what to say about this film, it just didn't really impress me that much. But I agree with many that as a debut film, it was Kevin McMullen's first movie ever as a director. It was pretty promising. There were already good shots, a pretty good character chemistry, it just didn't go that extra mile. Instead, a film I really enjoyed, and which you actually recommended that famous day in which I was desperately looking for something cheerful to watch, and you flooded me with so many awesome recommendations. I've been moving down the list. Anyway, the film I picked this month was Yesterday. The protagonist of Yesterday is an aspiring musician but who is stuck just playing the usual covers, being booked at small gigs. One day there is a huge worldwide blackout, the kind everybody was scared would happen when the year 2000 arrived. Right in that moment, our protagonist has a huge accident with a bus. He loses consciousness, and when he wakes up, some things have changed. The biggest being that nobody knows who the Beatles are. So he decides to start playing their pieces as his own, and from there the story evolves into something much bigger. I found this film absolutely hilarious. It definitely cheered me up, and the funniest aspect of it is mostly how the characters interact, how they don't mean to say funny things, but just because of how the situation says, they just have me cracking up. I would absolutely recommend watching this. Thank you so much for the suggestion, it made my evening. I then watched a film I had been avoiding for a very silly and embarrassing reason, and that is You Were Never Really Here, with a violent version of Joaquin Phoenix as a guy who carries out vengeance upon men who abuse of little girls. The very stupid reason for which I always avoided this film is that when you scroll quickly past the poster, it looks like a religious thing. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with a religious film. It's just not the usual thing I would pick. But for some reason, Joaquin Phoenix looked like Jesus. I don't know. That's the silly reason I avoided it. But then one day I saw a screen cap with his face completely splattered in blood, and I was like, Oh. Now, some say that this film is what Joker wanted to be. I'm going to leave that up to personal opinions, but there is definitely that crazy, angry violence here. This could have been one of the films which inspired the creators of Joker to see Phoenix in that role. And you can't imagine how silly I feel after actually watching the movie. Then I watched Vox Lux, or Lux, depending on how you pronounce it, a film starring Natalie Portman as a world-famous pop star, but who at the same time is struggling with a series of personal issues which aren't very helpful with her public image. Now, this film actually has a big opening, which I was absolutely not expecting. I know some people figured it out already from promotional information, the trailer and so on, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to completely skip over that. But something big happens and it makes the character who she is. So the first half of the film was pretty interesting. It shows us the build-up of the character, of her personality, who she becomes to be and why she becomes to be who she is. But after 2 hours, I was sort of just waiting for the end to come. And I'm wondering now if that was actually purposeful, because there is a lot about her character. Maybe us getting annoyed with her was part of it all. I then ticked off another film from my watch list, this time Overlord, a war horror film about a group of American soldiers who, during the Second World War, have the mission to destroy a Nazi radio tower in France. But upon arriving on location, they discover a much more macabre reality based on some insane experiments the Nazis were carrying out on people. Now, I think most of us actually expected this to be a bad movie. We were expecting a sort of cheap monster movie, the kind that turns out to be so bad that you actually watch it because it's so bad and you enjoy that, if that makes any sense. But in reality, it was quite well put together. Even the special effects were good. The CGI, even in the battle scenes, was not that terrible. So in the end, I pretty enjoyed it. If you're looking for something different, this could be an interesting choice. I then caught up with two 80s classics, The Breakfast Club from 1985 and Ferris Bueller's Day Off from 1986. Both these films are considered cult teen movies, and because of how famous they are, I kind of knew already what they spoke about. I had seen many clips from the films, but I'd never sat down and watched them all from beginning to end. The Breakfast Club is a story of a group of high schoolers who, as a form of punishment, are asked to go to school early on the weekend while it's closed and sit in the library and write an essay to reconsider their choices. Of course, all the characters are very different and they soon get to know each other, learn more about one another and about themselves. I once read a review with which I kind of agree, which said that nothing memorable actually happens in The Breakfast Club, but we still love it. We still love to see the interactions between these characters, and it's pretty interesting to see teens so many years later. Instead, Ferris Bueller's Day Off is a story of a kid who pretends to be ill to skip school with his friends, and they end up doing anything from going to baseball matches and museums to swimming pools and eating out at fancy restaurants, basically fooling every adult in the way, everything you would dream of doing as a rebellious teen. Although, again, these films don't really have a deeper message or a deeper meaning, I did enjoy them, and I think they're two of these cult movies you have to watch because they'll probably be referenced many times in other more recent films. One of those evenings, I actually watched a short film which doesn't tie in at all with all the other long films and movies and documentaries, but I had quite a few strong opinions on it and I thought I would share it. The short film is called What Did Jack Do? And it is created by David Lynch, who also stars as one of the two protagonists. Now, David Lynch is known for making particularly bizarre projects, and this short film is also weird. It's made to look like an old noir film, and it features a monkey being questioned about something he might have done. But the dialogues are made out of very odd sentences, and they seem to have no sense and progressively become more inquisitive. Now, I just think this was a simple, peculiar, different, interesting short film. But because it was made by David Lynch, basically the world has been hailing this as the best short film that has ever been made, the weirdest short film, something that only a master of the bizarreness like David Lynch could have done. I am so sure that if he hadn't been the director behind this film, it wouldn't have received a fraction of the interest. And that annoys me so much because it's like when you get a white t-shirt and then just print a logo on it and suddenly it's the thing you need. Anyway, this is not really part of the list of films and series. So back to our films. What is missing? Oh yeah, I watched Inside Llewyn Davis, a film many of you have been recommending. It's a story of a sort of aspiring musician, a failing musician. It's set in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York, which was actually a place I used to enjoy a lot when I used to live over in the States. And it's a place where many musical talents were born or were spotted. But Isaac plays a musician who is struggling financially. He's trying to get by day, but everything he does seems to create even more problems from which he then needs to get out. The film doesn't offer a particularly complex plot, but I really enjoyed it, and I loved the analysis of the feeling of failure, of being beat down and trying again, but still deep down not managing to let go of the feeling of always appearing as a disappointment. We're nearly getting to the end of the list. I watched an animated series which absolutely blew me away, and that was The Midnight Gospel. Now, this series was released on April 20th, 420, and the way it was presented gave us a little the impression, allow me to describe it like this, of a stoner series. What I mean is the only weed will allow you to see the freeway kind of story. But instead that was only a bait, because that element is only really referenced in the first episode, and then it dives into a world of mind-blowing discussions, some of which are sad, others uplifting, but all inspiring. Basically, the protagonist is a space podcaster, a galactic version of our podcaster, and through a simulator he visits various weird and particular worlds in which he meets and interviews an inhabitant. Because these worlds are so different and unusual and interesting, and they tend to be dealing with some sort of imminent threat, the discussions that arise are obviously very interesting. They are stimulating, they cover death, life, grief, love, happiness in a progressively deeper manner. The whole series actually feels like a kind of conversation you would have with your friends that would get deeper and darker as the night goes on. And because it's made to sound like a podcast, you could actually follow this series by just listening to it, although you would lose out on a lot of the psychedelic imagery. I then watched Green Room, a horror film about a punk band who agrees to play at a very dodgy location, which turns out to be a meeting point for neo-Nazis. Instead of a regular concert, during the evening, things get out of control, as was expected, and after people start getting seriously hurt, the neo-Nazis lock the band away in a room. They keep them hostage with no hint of wanting to let them free at any time soon. This film wasn't particularly astonishing. I would rather recommend watching many other titles on today's list. But what really was interesting is the fact that this film is all set basically within one room and the limited area surrounding it, and it still managed to keep us kind of nervous all the way to the end. During those days, I also watched a Studio Ghibli film called My Neighbors the Yamadas, which is very different from the usual anime style of other films they released. My Neighbor Totoro, Howl's Moving Castle, Spirited Away, Kiki's Delivery Service, and so on, because it's drawn in a very simple comic strip style, and often the backgrounds take inspiration from classic Japanese art. It's split into many smaller stories, making it feel more like a collection of short clips, so I actually watched the film over the course of a few days. The small episodes all revolve around family situations, cooking dinner, going to work, forgetting to do things, helping out, going on trips, with very simple dialogues. So it's very cute, it's very kawaii, but halfway into the film you sort of start to feel how heavy watching all these little episodes is. That's why I watched it over the course of a few days. I actually would watch it like before going to bed or at breakfast because it made me feel more cozy and safe and cute. Okay, then yeah, we have Eden Lake. I'm going to quickly talk about this film. I didn't even really want to include it because it's one of the films I'd recommend the least, along with Tall Girl. Nothing makes sense. In Eden Lake, your typical romantic couple decides to go camping on the side of a remote lake. When they get there, it sucks. There's just a gang of disrespectful kids who eventually start acting up with the couple. Regardless of that, the lovebirds still decide to keep on camping, but things get out of control with the kids teasing them, to the point that there is basically a deadly hunt between the two groups in the middle of the woods. Nothing in this film makes sense. It would have made sense if the couple's behaviour at the beginning of the film had been different. I'm trying to not give away spoilers, but basically it is scary when you actually get into the scary part. It is scary, it is anxiety fueling, it is a bit of all a twisted nightmare, but I couldn't shrug off the fact that it wouldn't have happened if the couple had behaved differently. I don't know, a lot of people actually love this film, so I'm going to leave it open to your opinion. Okay, then I watched The Squid and the Whale, a film by Noah Baumbach, who is known for creating films that focus on relationships between people, the natural way discussions come out, how people interrupt one another, rather than huge complex plots. For example, he was the director of Marriage Story with Adam Driver and Scarlett Johansson, which just recently was at the Oscars. Anyway, The Squid and the Whale is the story of a couple going through a divorce and having to settle all the situations that entails, including reorganizing their life with their two sons, who already go through all the issues you would encounter as an adolescent. So I enjoyed how I got caught up in the lives and issues of these four people and their cat, although half an hour earlier I didn't know anything about them. The same happened with Marriage Story, so I'm interested to catch up with more of Baumbach's films. I'm starting to move faster through the titles, otherwise this will be a very long video. Next, I watched the second season of Afterlife, a series I discovered a few months back, with season 2 being released just a few weeks ago. Afterlife is a dark comedy series created by Ricky Gervais, who also portrays the protagonist. It's the story of a guy who loses his wife to cancer and who becomes incredibly depressed, as she was his best friend, his reason to live. He has serious suicidal thoughts, and he finds that the only way of getting through in life for him is by treating other people rudely, because it makes him feel a little better about himself. During this, he actually gets to meet and befriend many new people, which range from postmen to sex workers, and he starts to reconsider many things. In my opinion, the first season had some more straightforward funny moments because of the way in which characters interact, because he behaves very arrogantly and rudely with others, while the second one tends to be more reflective. All these relationships he built with people make him think about a lot of issues. I'm really trying not to spoil anything, but I would really recommend giving it a try. Another work which speaks about love and the fear of death is Me, Earl and the Dying Girl, a film I was recommended a few years back, but which I only finally got round to watching now. The title mostly sums up the plot, in which the protagonist and his close friend Earl get to know a schoolmate who has leukemia. At first, the protagonist is forced to make friends with this girl through his mother, who insists he should be close to her to cheer her up, but over the course of time their relationship naturally gets stronger. This film was pretty captivating, and I definitely wasn't expecting a lot of visual work. For example, the characters make a series of films as a project, and it's interesting the way they were created, but it never received the same wide-stream attention as other coming-of-age films of the same time. For example, The Perks of Being a Wallflower, even The 14-Hour Stars, and The Spectacular Now I was speaking about earlier. On a more cheerful note, I watched Tropic Thunder, mostly because I was commissioned a video on Tom Cruise and I had to find out what it was all about. His character in the film, who is completely different from his usual athletic appearance. By the way, remember how earlier I was saying about Sacha Baron Cohen's films being criticised as being definitely not politically correct? Well, Tropic Thunder follows along very similar lines. The film focuses on various fading stars in the film industry and an attempt to create something big and memorable to save their career. The idea is to leave a group of actors in the middle of the jungle in a dangerous area of Thailand and film whatever happens. This film is totally politically incorrect, it makes fun of everybody, and it has a huge cast. There's Robert Downey Jr., Bill Hader, Tom Cruise, Matthew McConaughey, Ben Stiller, Jack Black. So if you're looking for something funny, this could be a good idea. Next, I watched Shoplifters, a Japanese film which had been on my watch list for a very long time, and which speaks of a family of people who get by in different ways. The title itself alludes to the fact that they often go stealing products from supermarkets. One day, while returning home after that activity, they spot a girl from the neighbourhood left out in the cold, a situation which they had often noticed. After taking her home and caring for her for the night, they realised that taking her home wouldn't be safe for her, that she would be better off with them. And things evolve from there. This is a touching and heartbreaking analysis of personal values, human behaviour, of what a family really is, and what you're willing to do for your loved ones. Then Netflix released basically one of the big films for the month, one of the few big films, Extraction, starring Chris Hemsworth. This film is not as bad as many were expecting, but it definitely wasn't even a Mission Impossible level film. It stars Chris Hemsworth as a mercenary who has to rescue the son of a big drug lord in Bangladesh. Obviously things don't run smoothly, and most of the film features high-level action, fistfights, car chases, explosion, a lot of heavy gunfire, jumping off of buildings, you name it. These action sequences were very well choreographed, and many of the big scenes were made with practical effects. The problem is that there wasn't that much beyond the action sequences. The character interactions were very limited, their development wasn't particularly interesting, so not as bad as expected, but could definitely have worked on the character arcs. Then I watched a horror film for which I'd seen the trailer years ago, but which then I'd completely forgotten about, and that is The Visit by M. Night Shyamalan. Now, Shyamalan is known for making particularly unexpected, creepy plots, and this film was no different. The story portrays two kids who visit their grandparents for the first time in their life, as their mother never really got on well with her parents. So they leave to go stay with them in this house in the middle of nowhere. Although at first the couple seem pretty regular people with the ups and downs of old age, after a while really odd and frightening events begin to occur, and it just gets nightmarish. It had been a long time since I actually had to cover my eyes while watching a film, so I definitely recommend this along with a few other horror films I mentioned earlier, for example The Invisible Man and Misery. Then after watching many films on my computer, one night I decided to switch on the TV. And the one night that I decided to switch on the TV, they were shown at the same time Blade Runner 2049 and The Departed. So there was a lot of decision making about which of the two to rewatch. In the end, I picked The Departed, which is actually one of my favourite films in general. It's a film I've always recommended, and it's probably the film I would recommend most out of all the titles on today's list. The Departed is a Scorsese film set in Boston and which follows an organised crime group led by Jack Nicholson's character, who sends one of his men to infiltrate the police, to be a spy inside the police force. But the police also send one of their own men to infiltrate the mob. This film is widely recognised as one of the best of all time, so if you haven't seen it yet, definitely check it out. Instead, a film I wouldn't really recommend, I'm going to skip quickly over this, is Slice, a comedy horror film about pizza delivery guys who were murdered in a town which is basically split into two neighbourhoods, one in which living people live and one in which dead people, ghost people live. I think this film was aiming for that retro, weird, slightly trashy horror film vibe where everything is a bit over the top and fun in the wrong moment, but it somehow never really got engaging, and I think that after the initial interest about the novelty of the concept, it was forgotten pretty quickly. Then, upon huge request, I finally watched Sin City, of which the DVD had been sitting there for months, but the moment came. Sin City has a very distinctive look. It's made to appear like the noir graphic novel on which it's based, and it has many unique or unexpected moments. It's very hard to explain with words, but it has a very engaging visual component. It's also split into different chapters, different sections. My favourite one was the one in which Bruce Willis's character is wrongly imprisoned for years. He is forgotten by the world, but he keeps in touch with the little girl he saved, his only company for years, until she grows and she is portrayed by Jessica Alba. I think this is one of those big films you have to re-watch multiple times because every time you will find smaller details which give you a wider understanding of the film. Then around the same time I was making another commission video, this time on Dwayne Johnson, and watching through various footage from his career, I had to re-watch some clips from Pain and Gain, and I remembered just how much I loved that film, and so I decided to watch it again. This film is so funny. It's presented as your regular muscle-packed heist film and all the characters are convinced they live that thug life, but in reality it's full of lines that just make you burst out laughing at the screen. And it's all a true story. The three characters are gym buffs, fitness lovers, but who aren't satisfied with the life they live in, mostly because of this idea that they are above regular people, and so they end up getting caught in criminal activities. You definitely have to watch this. I can't believe how much I laugh every time. The dialogues are priceless. That same night, I was doing a Q&A over on Instagram, and one of you asked whether I'd ever seen the film Contact. Now, I hadn't ever seen it, but I checked out the trailer and I was like, I'm in. This is one of the few films about space and extraterrestrial life that don't just stop at the bad monsters out there concept. It develops the idea in a mature way. The protagonist is a scientist portrayed by Jodie Foster who dedicates her whole life to searching for a contact from outer space, until one day she actually finds it, and the consequences are enormous. I'm not going to say much else because everything that happens beyond that discovery is a total spoiler, but this is one of the few films which really take the topic seriously. They show the passion for science, so I really wish I could have seen this years ago. Then I watched a film that has actually been a big request for an explanation video, but for which I kind of need an explanation video myself because it was very complicated. The film is Primer, a low-budget movie which went on to becoming a huge cult film about science and complicated time-bending plots. Two guys build a machine which turns out to tamper with time, with time travel. What makes everything so simple is the way the characters interact. They don't simplify their scientific jargon, and then there are all these philosophical questions about tampering with reality, of these overlaying plots and different scenes. So I'm sorry, but I can't do an explanation video because I still have to completely understand it myself. Then towards the end of the month, I watched a film called Chirac, directed by Spike Lee. The title is based on the fact that apparently at one point more people were dying by violent crimes in Chicago compared to the deaths in the Iraq War, hence the title Chirac. This film is very peculiar because it's based on a classic Greek story, so all the characters seem to speak in a poetic, rhyming manner. Everybody has mythology-based names, and the way they interact often appears like a staged situation. In the film, the partners of the members of enemy gangs get together and decide to deny their men sex until violent crimes will end. So it's interesting because it covers a very important topic, but in a very unique manner. Next was a weird film called Extinction, in which your regular Joe starts having bizarre dreams, but very realistic dreams, about a sort of end-of-the-world situation going to happen. And then an end-of-the-world situation actually happens. The city is suddenly attacked by mysterious entities. This film actually develops in an unexpected way. The first part is not particularly engaging, but as the film moves on, it touches some topics which I never would have expected, which I guess balance out the terrible CGI used in some other scenes. Then the last series I watched was called Never Have I Ever, which actually has very young characters, so they are 15, not even 16, but which also appeals to an older audience. The series follows an Indian American family, and in particular it focuses on the daughter Debbie, who is struggling coping with the death of her father, a strict mother, a beyond perfect cousin, and the normal issues of high school. It was absolutely hilarious, hardly ever repetitive, and it appeals to young audiences, but it also gets the older age group because it shows the perspective of the adults in the story, for example, the mother. So I would definitely like to watch more of this. I would definitely be fine with a second season. We're nearly at the end. I watched a film I had on my watch list for years, Yi Yi, which translated is a 1 and a 2. It's the story of a family and of 4 members in particular. The young boy is having trouble fitting in at school, a teenage girl with all the teenage drama, the father whose wife is stressed and who is also stressed from work, and the elderly grandmother they all look after. I actually found out this film was incredibly popular when it was released around 20 years ago. It won a ton of prizes, and I can definitely see why. No shot is charmless. Everything is studied, even the transition scenes in which there's just a rain or a building are absolutely beautiful, along with all the analysis of family relationships, of decisions, the beauty in the normality. And now we have reached the last film of the month, and that is an Italian film called In Guerra per Amore, which is translated to At War with Love. The film is by an Italian journalist and director known by his nickname of Pif, who I have always admired right from back at the time when he used to make shorter projects about different and uncommon topics. In Guerra per Amore, he also stars as the protagonist, a young Sicilian who moves to New York City, but who can't marry the love of his life because she has been promised in marriage to the son of an important mafia boss. The only way he can get around this issue is going back to Italy and asking her lover's father for permission to marry her. So he enrolls in the army, returns to Italy, where all sorts of adventures occur. What I've always admired about Pif is how he takes very serious topics and covers them in a light-hearted, fun manner, managing to spread the message to a much wider audience. And with that, we have reached the end of today's list. If you're still watching, thank you so much for sticking around. I would love to hear your opinion on the films if you've seen any of these. I would love to hear what you've been watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you soon in the next one. Bye.